Remember that old saying, you'll own nothing and be happy? Sounds crazy, right? Until you take a closer look at Mark Carney's plan for Canada. In his blueprint, Canada Strong, the Liberals lay out a $225 billion strategy to dramatically expand government ownership and control over housing, data centers, energy, critical minerals, digital tech, and even artificial intelligence. The Liberals' plan explicitly states that more than half of its incremental expenditure over the next 4 years will be capital related. Now, that might sound like typical budgetary language, but it's actually the key to understanding what's really going on here. So let me lay this out. The distinction between a capital and operating expense is very important in this context. Operating expenses are things like social program funding, grants, or salaries. They result in zero ownership, whereas capital expenses, or CapEx, is the money a government or business spends on acquiring, upgrading, or maintaining its assets. So these are things that will go on the government's balance sheet, just like Mark Carney said, because again, they own or control them. So when the Liberals say that over 50% of new spending is capital, what they're telling you is, we're not just funding programs, we're building assets and we're keeping them. And according to this new plan, 64.2% of federal spending will fall under capital expenses. This means the government will be expanding its state control by 100% more than in 2021. In other words, this is an expansion of state control and ownership unlike anything we've ever seen. Now, let's take a closer look at where this capital is going and what it implies. We'll start with housing. Carney wants to pump $35 billion into prefab and affordable homes. This fund and these projects would be managed by Build Canada Homes, a proposed government agency. Because this is listed as a capital expense, the government will own or control significant housing stock, especially if it's built on federal land. Why is this a problem? When the government owns the homes, they control the terms, who gets to live where, and what the rent is, maybe even what views you're allowed to express, and this is not a stretch. Public housing policies have been used to enforce social compliance in other parts of the world, and Canada is clearly not immune to tyranny. Next up is digital infrastructure and AI. Carney proposes funding data centers, high-speed communication networks, and AI infrastructure, including partnerships with the private sector. The plan also mentions investments in digital supply chain solutions and rural broadband, so internet. The implication? Government ownership of data centers or digital networks would make the state a major force in tech infrastructure with control over critical digital assets. If the government owns the AI systems, data centers, and digital networks, they're not just delivering the service, they're collecting the data. That's a surveillance state in the making. Add in centralized digital ID or financial systems, and access to basic services could one day depend on political alignment or ideological compliance. Once again, they have frozen our bank accounts for ideological reasons, so this is not hyperbole. Now on to clean energy and critical minerals. Carney wants to make investments in critical mineral projects, electric vehicle charging networks, and clean energy infrastructure. While some projects may involve private partnerships, government-funded infrastructure like EV charging stations, energy grids, and even stakes in mining projects would remain on the public balance sheet. Why is this a bad trend? If the state owns the grid and clean energy infrastructure, it ultimately gets to decide where the power flows and where it doesn't. If you want to push citizens towards certain behaviors, just control their access to heat, fuel, or electricity. Think carbon rationing or smart meters linked to a social credit style system. And let's be honest, this would make it a whole lot easier to force people into 15-minute cities. And for anyone who still believes this is just benevolence, the plan does not clarify whether these assets will be privatized, leased out, or kept under permanent state control, which pretty much wipes out the only charitable interpretation this strategy had going for it. According to Mark Carney's own numbers, over 50% of new spending is capital related, so this isn't just about stimulus. It's about a massive state footprint. Unfortunately, it does get a little worse, so bear with me here. The Liberals claim that their $225 billion in deficit spending will trigger $500 billion in private investment, which sounds nice until you check their own math. Their fiscal multipliers range from 0.7 to 1.2, meaning these investments may not even pay for themselves, especially not in a shaky economy with US tariffs. So what does this mean? It means that more tax dollars will need to be pumped into all of these projects to make up for the lack of private investment, which means more state assets and even more government control. Given Carney's experience in finance and a clear error in their own math, I might suggest this isn't a miscalculation, but rather the actual plan. Now, some people might argue that government control isn't that big a deal or it won't be that expansive, but the truth is, dependency equals control. The more basic needs the government provides, the more power it has to dictate your life. When the state is your landlord, energy provider, and data gatekeeper, you're not just a citizen, you're a dependent, and dependence can be controlled. Would you openly criticize a government that controls your home, your internet, and your electricity? That owns infrastructure you rely on to live, work, and speak? Even if no laws are passed, the threat of retaliation is enough to keep people quiet and under control. Think self-censorship through COVID, and my point is pretty well made. The Liberals won't say it out loud, but here's the truth. If they don't intend to expand state control over housing, AI, and infrastructure, they wouldn't be tracking these as capital expenses. It's that simple. So whether you believe this is good, bad, or somewhere in between, they are intentionally expanding state control over our nation and our lives. Period.